So last week we dealt with a question that intrigues people, has been very intriguing to all of humanity, and it's this question of what happens after we die. We dealt with these questions of what happens to our loved ones. Will we see them again? This week we're going to deal with an equally intriguing question, and it's this question of what will happen at the end of the world. Okay, Paul deals with some pretty heavy topics in this letter. Specifically, how can we prepare for the end of the world? What will it look like? Will we face some sort of judgment? And these are questions that are interesting to think about, and in different ways, I think, affect the decisions we make. People who believe that the end is near have made some pretty drastic life choices throughout the centuries. One of the more recent ones I remember is when I first came to Taiwan, there was this very prominent religious leader who predicted that there would be an earthquake, a huge earthquake in Taiwan, which would be followed by a tsunami. And I remember this because I was ready to teach class, and my secretary came in and told me there's going to be an earthquake. I was like, how would she know that? That's quite amazing. And so I found out later it's because this leader had told people that the end is near. And so people sold their possessions, actually, and they moved up to Yangmingshan to avoid the tsunami. Right? The idea being, if the world's coming to an end anyway, then what's the point of having my stuff? So I might as well get rid of it, okay? Some of us who maybe were not in Taiwan or didn't know that that was such a big deal back then would remember Y2K. And it was this time in history where we didn't know what was going to happen because we weren't sure if computer programs were ready to handle the switch from the year 1999 to 2000. And so we envisioned banks going crazy. We envisioned airplanes falling out of the air. And so if you read about what people did during that time, they actually hid underground, some of them, in these bunkers to protect themselves from the disaster that was going to happen when there was this end of the world scenario, okay? And so the church was very much going through the same kind of question of when is this going to happen and how do we prepare for it? So here's what Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you, for you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light, children of day. We are not of the night or of the darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet the hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we might be with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up. So you hear this phrase a lot, the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord, we have to understand, is not actually this specific day, but it's more like a season. The day of the Lord is really a series of events that lead up to God coming back. And it's an Old Testament term that the church would have been very aware of and had some sort of idea of what that looks like. One of the places we find it in the Old Testament is the book of Amos. Right? This might be the first time we've ever looked at the book of Amos at this church. Chapter 5, verse 18. It says, "Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. Why would you have the day of the Lord? It is darkness and not light, as if man fled from a lion and a bear met him, or went into the house and leaned his hand against the wall and a serpent bit him. Is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light and gloom with no brightness in it?" So what should be surprising to you is this day of the Lord, it's not a happy day. The description is saying it's like you expected something good to happen, like you're running away from a lion and then you meet a bear, right? And so it seems like it's this day that's actually characterized by darkness. And the reason why the day of the Lord is not necessarily a happy day for everybody is it's actually the season of judgment. It's this time where God is going to come to judge the world. And we're going to realize that all our actions that we hoped God would have ignored, God actually kept a very detailed record of that and will hold us accountable for those actions. And so one of the questions the church had is whether or not they had to go through this season, is whether or not they had to live through this day of the Lord. Now, they knew they wouldn't be judged, but they also knew that this season would have a lot of suffering, and it would be a very crazy time in Earth's history. And so they were wondering, do we as a church also have to go through this day of the Lord? And they felt that if only they knew the exact day and exact time, then they could make preparations for it. Just like the people that made preparations for Y2K or made preparations for other end-of-the-world scenarios. So let's look at Paul's response. In verse 2, here's what he says. For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. Now that description is a very appropriate description because it indicates that this day is something that will come suddenly and unexpectedly. You can't plan for a thief to rob you. You can't schedule the moment that a thief will rob you. If you've talked to Tina, she went to Brazil on a business trip this past summer. And my wife, being born in Brazil, knows what it's like there. And there's few rules you have to follow when you go to Brazil. Number one, watch out for piranhas and man-eating snakes, okay? Rule number 2 is don't wear any name brand clothing to make it seem like you have money, because you will, without a doubt, be robbed in Brazil. It's lawless, okay? It's a scary, scary place. Nobody should go there. So Tina was with her coworker, and I believe in the cab driver, the taxi driver even told them to be careful, don't show anything off. And her coworker, not being very alert, was walking around with his iPhone. And sure enough, what happened? Somebody tried to rob him, right? And so that's a great picture. He couldn't have planned that that person was going to rob him, because a thief does not announce themselves. And so what Paul is saying here is the day that God will come will be unexpected. God's return will be unexpected. Okay? And then he goes on and he draws this other analogy in verse 3. While people are saying there is peace and security, then suddenly destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. Okay? So this is also a pretty good description of what this day looks like, because think about labor. Or maybe don't think about it, but the interesting thing about labor is you know it's coming. It's going to happen, but you don't know quite when. Even though the doctor may say, this is when you're due, it's not an exact science. And all we know is it's going to happen, but we still don't know quite when. So Jesus is going to come back. This day of the Lord will happen, but we don't know when exactly. When we were pregnant with Audrey, the doctor told us that she was most likely going to come around November 20-something. And so I figured the week before, we're approaching this day when we are going to move from being a family of 3 to a family of 4, which is drastically different because now it's like tied, right? The parents don't outnumber the kids anymore. And so I made reservations on November 18th for one of my favorite restaurants in Taipei. And on the morning of November 18th, my wife started feeling labor pains. And I remember my first thought was, does that mean I have to cancel our reservations? You know, and I didn't feel labor pains per se, but I felt a lot of emotional pain at having to make that choice, right? So no matter how well we planned it, even though we knew it was coming, we didn't quite know when. And even though we went about life as normal, there actually came this pretty big interruption in an unexpected way, okay? Another reason that this is a great analogy is this. Once you start going into labor, there's no stopping it. There's no turning back. You can slow labor down, but you can't prevent it from eventually happening. Right? And so this morning, the morning that Audrey was born, we were kind of waiting, and then we decided we should probably go to the hospital. This seems like a pretty serious situation. So we get to the cab, the taxi, and the taxi driver, I think, realized that he had a pregnant woman in labor, then proceeded to drive as carefully as any taxi driver in Taipei has ever driven. Like below the speed limit, very slow, very carefully, and the whole time I'm thinking, please hurry, because I don't want this to happen in your taxi. Right? And so we get to the hospital, and the nurses check my wife, and they're like, the baby will come soon. And first question she asked, can I still get drugs? Can I still get painkillers? They're like, no, it's too late. And so at that moment, we realized, this is going to happen. We can't stop this. So they sent me down. They say, go register, right? And so I went to go register, and it was really rushed. And I come back up, and my wife is gone. I'm just like, what happened to her? And before I know it, this nurse flings this hospital gown in my face. She says, put these on. All right, so I put it on, and I look over, and my wife is in this other room about to go into labor. And I found out later that what was happening is she said, I feel like pushing. And the doctors or the nurses said, don't push, which I don't think is the proper medical advice for any nurse to give when a person is about to give birth. They said, don't push. In other words, they're saying, make it stop. But you know what? No matter how hard she tried, that baby was coming. That baby was coming. I don't want to get into it, but, right? And so the reason why I think this is a great analogy is we have to understand that once it starts, it's inescapable. So not only is God's return going to be unexpected, it's going to be inescapable. It's going to happen. The whole trajectory of history is heading towards this season. Every event that's occurring today is heading towards this season, whether we believe it or not, or whether we like it or not. Right? So the day of the Lord is going to come unexpectedly. You don't know when a thief is going to come, and it's going to be unstoppable, and we will not be able to escape it. And so what Paul is saying is this. You, church, are so concerned with the specific day and the hour, but it's a concern you can't even remedy because we actually can't know when this season is going to start. Even in Matthew 24, here's what Jesus said, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. And so it's going to be this day where people are going to assume it's business as usual, and they're going to be surprised. But what's important is what Jesus is saying is, I don't even know. Only God knows. So if Jesus doesn't even know, then the church should not be spending their time wondering and trying to figure out when this is going to happen. And so the question we still have to answer is, because we know that this is coming at some point, maybe our lifetime, maybe not, how should we live in light of that knowledge? Right? That's what Paul's going to address next. How should we live in light of the fact that we know God's going to come back? In chapter 5, verse 6, here's what he says. So then, let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake. Turn to your neighbor and say, stay awake and be sober, okay? Stay awake, keep awake, and be sober, right? So the solution is not to try to figure out the day and the time. The solution is to stay alert and stay awake. In other words, Paul is saying, because you don't know, live your life in readiness. Be ready for it to come at any time. Don't let your guard down. Other people will ignore this truth. Other people will assume it's just some sort of religious myth, and they're going to be asleep instead of awake. But Paul says, be ready. And think about this. God is so smart by not telling us the day. God is so wise that he doesn't tell us when this is going to happen. Let's say we knew that it was going to occur in the year 2022. What would a lot of people do? They'll just sin up to that point. And then all of a sudden, okay, cut it off. Now I give my life to God. Or what else would we be tempted to do if we knew that that day was coming at a very specific time? We'd quit our jobs. Right? We'd go live it up. We wouldn't bother taking care of our responsibilities because what's the point there? The world's going to end anyway. We wouldn't pursue the calling that God has given us maybe. We wouldn't pursue raising a family. We wouldn't pursue all these other things if we knew the time. But God keeps it from us in order to encourage us to stay awake. And look at why he tells us. Verse 5, for you are children of light, not children of day. And so the reason why we need to stay alert is not out of fear. The reason we need to stay alert is because we are children of light. And so Paul is saying this. Children of light have a different reaction to this truth. Like the past 2 weeks, we talked about children of light are not going to live as the world does. Children of light are going to grieve when someone passes away, but they're going to have a different hope. And so now, because you're children of light, you have to be alert. Think about this. Children, they don't dread the moment their father is coming home in a healthy family relationship. Children don't dread the moment their father is returning. They live with expectancy. And that's the call to us. Not to dread this moment, not to be stressed about what's going to happen, but live with expectancy. A theologian, when discussing this, said this: an indifferent church lacks motivation, a panicked church lacks peace. However, an expectant church is filled with passion. And so we're going to look at these three as kind of a way to unpack this idea. An indifferent church, a panicked church, and an expectant church. One of the theories of what was happening at that time is because the church thought that that day was going to come very soon and within their lifetime, they started to withdraw from the world, and they started to quit their job. And what happened is basically they became indifferent to the world. This is not so unlike what happened in the modern church, actually, around the 1980s and the 1970s, especially in America, where they thought that the world was coming to an end, that there were all these signs pointing to that. And so all these Christian leaders started stepping away from the world and just focus their energies on the church with the intention of, well, what's the point? This world is not for long anyway. And what that created is it created this vacuum of Christian influence. And there was not as much Christian influence within the workplace, within the world, because the church had disengaged and thought, well, the world's doomed anyway, so what's the point in being involved in matters of the world? They were indifferent, right? And Paul's whole point is that knowing that God is coming, it's not an excuse to avoid our responsibility. It's not an excuse to forget about the world and the affairs of the world. That's not what alertness looks like. And in fact, because we know this day is coming, all the more we should care about the world. All the more we should engage the world. Because I've said it before, we're plan A to save the world, and there is no plan B. Everyone in this room, this is the plan to save the world. Right? What does it say in Matthew chapter 5:16? In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So we don't want to be an indifferent church that disengages because we have this knowledge. But at the same time, we don't want to be an anxious church. So I mentioned before that Thessalonians were very stressed about wondering whether they had to go through this season of judgment. Because here's the question. The question was this, and it was unclear to them. Would Jesus bring us up before all these events, or during all these events, or after all these events? Now, which one's the most appealing? Clearly before all these events, right? And they didn't know. And we still don't know. It's still a hotly debated topic when the word is rapture, actually is going to happen, okay? And by the way, those movies, they're very unbiblical, so don't watch them. But okay. Anyway, so they didn't know. And what's interesting is Paul doesn't answer the question of with the order. Maybe Paul doesn't even know. But what he does want them to know is that God doesn't want them to be anxious about his return. Because like I said before, when someone is coming, you know somebody is coming, you can wait for them with anxiety, or you can wait for them with expectancy, depending on your relationship with them. That's why Paul says in verse 4, but you're not darkness for that day to surprise you. In other words, it's not something you need to worry about because you're not darkness, but you're a child of light. I'm going to show you a clip of a show called Parking Wars. Anyone ever heard of this? It's pretty obscure. So what the show is about is it follows these people, these officers who enforce parking laws. So basically, they give tickets if someone is parked illegally, okay? In Taiwan, oftentimes, I see mostly the older people like yelling at police officers. So it's kind of like that. So these people got caught parking illegally, okay? So can we watch the clip?
If there was no parking authority, the city would be a mess. The city will be a mess.
Free! Boy, no, I'm a handicapped car.
You get 1 hour for it.
No, I was told by the police officer over there that I didn't need to put money in it.
You do, sir. You get 1 hour for free with the handicap.
And you know what we'll do with the ticket?
I'm sorry, sir. I already wrote the ticket. I can't take it back.
Come on, man. This is ridiculous, man.
When you parked this morning at that other meter, was it a broken meter?
Yes.
See, your mistake was you parked at a broken meter, you left and came back, and you came back to an unspaced spot. See, I understand that.
What you mean you can't take it back?
Once this ticket starts to print out, I cannot take it back.
Look, this one is broken. That one is broken.
We'll get it fixed.
See, that's what I'm saying. It's all a game.
So how is that my fault? Well, you got 3 hours free. You got 3 hours free.
It's all a racket, man.
Sorry about that, sir.
Ain't no sorry. You don't care?
No, I do care.
No, you don't.
That's where you're wrong. I do care. If you would have got there before I hit print, I would have gave you a rescission. Simple.
This is a disgrace, especially that I am handicapped. I can barely walk from here a half a block. I cannot walk.
Tell that little is a piece of cop, meter maid.
Because he was misinformed by a police officer, he decided to take it out on me.
You little
Happens all the time.
There's a lot of anger and entitlement in America, right? But let's put yourself in that situation where you had violated some law. So maybe it's not that you parked illegally. Maybe it's more serious. Maybe you were speeding and you got caught. Or maybe you caused an accident. And you're sitting in your car or scooter, and behind you, you see that the judge is coming, the officer is coming to give you the ticket that you deserve, right? And think about the emotions you go through. Maybe it's anger. Maybe there's some confusion at that moment. Maybe it's shame because it's kind of an embarrassing situation. Maybe it's dread because you don't know how much the fine is. Maybe it's going to be really expensive. And so now imagine as the police officer, the judge, the person who's going to judge whether you're right or wrong, comes towards you and you realize that it's your best friend. Think of the sense of relief. And you're going to feel that relief, listen to this, not because you've done anything that would get you out of it. You deserve that ticket, but you're going to feel that sense of relief because of your relationship with the judge. And that's the point that Paul is making here in chapter 5, verse 9 and 10. For God has not destined us for wrath, but to obtain salvation through the Lord Jesus Christ. So what is he saying? He's saying God is not going to put you through judgment because of your relationship with him, right? Through the Lord Jesus Christ. So God does not want us to live with uncertainty about our eternity. Instead, he wants us to be secure about our eternity, and knowing that tomorrow is secure will then launch us to be able to live fruitfully for today. So we don't want to be an indifferent church. We don't want to be an anxious church. Instead, what we want to be is an expectant church. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. In verse 8, here's what Paul says. But since we belong to this day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. What's the imagery? War. Right? The imagery that Paul is using is, it's war. We're living in a battle. And you don't put on a breastplate and helmet just for fun. You put those on if you're going into a battle. And so the implication is, yes, we know this day is coming, but we have to have this mentality in some sense that we are soldiers in a war. Soldiers, see, they're always ready for battle. Soldiers need to live with expectancy and urgency and purpose. Soldiers don't disengage from the battle, they get right into it. Soldiers don't fall asleep and they don't ignore this fact that God is coming back, but they stay alert. And so Paul is saying this, don't just wait for what's coming. Make the most of every day that God has given you because you're in a battle. That's how we stay alert. 2 Timothy says this about soldiers. No soldier gets entangled in civilian pursuits since his aim is to please the one who enlisted him. A soldier doesn't get caught up in the world. A soldier stays focused on the calling. And whether we like to admit it or not, we exist in a world that is very hostile to the life that God is calling us to live. We exist in a world that can easily use its influence to derail the calling that God has given us. And so this battle we're in, we got to be aware that the battle we're in requires us to take our faith very, very seriously. That's alertness. And so the question I want us to kind of wrestle with, maybe now or this week, is just this question. Are we taking our faith seriously? Are we aware that we are in this battle? Are we aware that God is going to come back and we need to live a life of alertness instead of a life of sleep? Are we taking this truth, this life, this calling seriously? Right? Because what does Paul say? He says, put on. That means that we have to make deliberate choices and be disciplined enough to take this Christian life seriously. Put on. You don't wake up in the morning and all of a sudden you find a helmet on your head. I hope not. Okay, if you did, then some crazy things happened the night before, right? But put on. Make a choice to stay alert. A soldier is never going to enter a battle without being prepared. And so Paul is saying we as Christians need to have spiritual preparation in order to stay alert and in order to fight in this battle around us. And he gives very practical advice. He says this, put on the breastplate of faith and love and the helmet of hope. This could be a separate sermon on its own, but just simply said, here's what Paul's saying. Protect your heart and protect your mind. All right, the breastplate protects the heart and the helmet protects the mind. And these are two things that we can so easily be careless about. These are two things that we can fall asleep on. That we can enter seasons where our heart slowly drifts away from God, and before we know it, we are so cold, we are so passionless, we are so lost. Or we can enter these seasons where our mind starts to get off-centered and we start believing the things that are not in line with God's truth because, for whatever reason, that way of thinking just seems so right at the moment. Or maybe that way of thinking seems so better than this old-fashioned Christianity thing. And Paul is saying, no, if you are going to have impact, if you are going to stay alert, you got to protect your heart and protect your minds. Right? And how we protect our hearts is Paul says it, you need faith and love. And faith to a Christian is not wishful thinking. Faith to a Christian is knowing in our hearts that God is going to do what he says he's going to do. That when God says he will protect you, he will protect you. When God says he will provide, he will provide. When God says he has a calling, he has a calling. When God says that he will come eventually. So maybe some of us need to ask God to put us in situations that builds that breastplate of faith. Maybe we need to look for situations where there's no way we could accomplish it on our own. And the only way we're going to have any sort of success or bear any sort of fruit is if God is in that situation. Some of us need to get out of our comfort zone to build up this faith. Maybe some of us need to listen to stories of how God is faithful in other people's lives, so that when he feels absent in our lives, we could be reminded that that's not our God, or that God will answer to those who patiently wait for him. And to protect our mind, Paul says we need to have the hope that provides security. What's he talking about? Our salvation. We need to guard our minds by knowing this fundamental truth, that God is going to save us, that our future is set and determined. And these are all very practical ways that Paul gives the church and us as a way to stay alert, as a way to avoid falling asleep when we should be expectant. And so today, I want us to just kind of think about these questions. All right, can I have the music team come up? Can we close our eyes? And just as a way, some questions to reflect about. It's just the question I asked earlier. Are you taking your faith seriously? Are you aware that you are in a battle? Are you aware that there is a war raging for your attention and your devotion around you? Are you aware that God is coming back, and that means so much in the way we should live? One question that gets asked oftentimes is this question of, what would you do if you knew God was coming back tomorrow? And maybe we could think about how you would answer that question. And maybe the question then I would ask you is, why not start living that way today? And so in whatever way God brings to your mind, maybe there's areas where you're not serious. There's areas where you've let your guard down. There's areas where you've fallen asleep and you're not alert. Maybe today is a wake-up call. And that God would use this time between you and he to just encourage you, to point out weak spots, blind spots, and then to start to journey along with you in putting that under his control and his plan to sanctify you.